Hello, everyone. My name is Miranda Natalia Alvarez, a beautiful, long Latino name. I'll be your moderator for today. A little bit about me. I have grown up in the Lehigh Valley and grown up in Pennsylvania. So this symposium today is super special to my heart, being Latino and growing up in this area and going really K through 12 and college here. We're going to be talking about research from our communities. We have 4 wonderful panelists today. We have Jennifer Hinojosa from Centro at City University of New York. She'll be presenting on data stories on Lehigh Valley Puerto Ricans. We have Erika Davis with us, who is from the University of Florida and based or from Allentown, presenting on improvement for whom, how discourses of development contribute to the dispersal of the valley's growing Latina population. Wilberto Sicard from Yale Law School and Lehigh University, teaching us a bit about the Allentown Puerto Rican community and context. And last but not least, Mericel Mirabal from Lehigh University, currently working on her undergrad degree here on being Dominican in Reading, Pennsylvania. A few things before we get started. The space, if you've been in other sessions, has been super affirming, thought challenging, and a really great place for engagement. So we want to keep it respectful and honor one another's scholarship and ask engaging questions. So if you have questions as our panelists are presenting, feel free to drop them in the chat. We will be leaving all questions and answers for the end. But if you're like me, I forget my question if I don't ask it in the moment. So drop it in the chat so we can bookmark it and revisit it at the end. With that in mind, if Jennifer would like to take the stage.
Thank you so much. And I'm gonna share my screen right here. Okay, can you guys see my screen? Yeah, okay. So my presentation is about data stories on Lehigh Valley Puerto Ricans. So what I'm going to be presenting here today is give a bit more context about Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania, and then we're sort of make our way down to the county level, which is Lehigh Valley in this case. So we are somewhat constrained with the data availability at the moment. So I'll try my best in sort of showing some data numbers from the census. So let me just move this here. Sorry, there we go. So just to give some context, we're going to use the 2019 data because the 2020 data, when they break it down by Hispanic or Latino groups, it's not available at the moment. So we're going to have to rely a bit on the 2019 data. So with that being said, in 2019, so I'm trying to move this, I don't know, sorry. Yep. Okay. I have that Zoom video, so I'm like moving it. All right, so here we go. So with the 2019 data, Pennsylvania is a state with the fourth state with the largest Puerto Rican population. With that being said, currently with the 2019 data, there's about 493,000 Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania. That's accounting for about 82% of the Puerto Rican population in the US. So Florida is the state with the largest Puerto Rican population, followed by New York, I believe New Jersey, and Pennsylvania is a fourth. At the state level, Puerto Ricans account for about 4% of the total population in Pennsylvania. So that's pretty interesting. However, when we look at the Hispanic or Latino population, Puerto Ricans make up 50%. And I'll go in the next few slides the breakdown of that. When we compare the 2016 to 2019, Puerto Ricans grew by about 7.5%. So meaning that between 2016, the Puerto Rican population in Pennsylvania was about 444,000 and then went up to 493. Now, when we compare that growth rate of 7.5% with the state overall, that's pretty high because the growth rate for Pennsylvania was only about 0.1%. Now, this can all change when the 2020 census data does come out, but the reason why I looked at 2016 is because it's a year before Maria, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So here's just like a pie chart of the breakdown. So like I said, 50% of the Hispanic population are Puerto Ricans. And if we compare it to other groups, that's followed by Mexicans, which make up 17% of the Hispanic population in Pennsylvania, followed by Dominicans, South Americans with 7%, Central Americans with 6%, and other Hispanic or Latino groups 5%. And lastly, Cubans make up 2% of the Hispanic population in Pennsylvania. Now, just to sort of give you a bit of a vision sort of here, because I know I'm spitting out all these numbers, right? I'm more of like a visual person. And if we look at 2015 to 2019, you see that Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania, slightly declined between 2015 to 2016. From 447,000 to 444. Then we see like a slight increase, right? From 444,000 to 445 between 2016 and 2017. Now look at this jump right here. This I find very interesting. And that is because of Maria, right? So between 2017 to 2018, the Puerto Rican population grew from 445,000 to 477. So we see that that is perhaps largely attributed to Maria. And then now with the 2019, it slightly grew. I mean, still growth from 447 to 493. But again, it will be interesting to see what the 2020 census shows us with the Puerto Rican population. But what I also want to bring up was that even before Maria, there was a lot of interstate migration happening. For example, from Florida, Puerto Ricans from Florida to Pennsylvania, New York to Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania, is a pretty population destination choice for Puerto Ricans. But overall, Puerto Ricans are very highly mobile population. So they move from one place to another. And we saw that very clearly when post Maria happened, because then the conversation was about how many Puerto Ricans were in Pennsylvania, how many Puerto Ricans were in Florida, give us the exact numbers, right? But this is pretty telling, because this just shows that jump between 2017 to 2018, how that Puerto Rican population grew in a 1-year span, right? So let me move to the next slide. Whoops. Now, going back to that conversation about migration, here we see just gives us a bit of a picture of like the migration from Puerto Rico to Pennsylvania. So if we look at, let me move this again, 2016, there was about 7,000 individuals who moved from Puerto Rico to PA. That slightly went up in 2017. But again, we see that jump between 2017 to 2018, right? And then it went down. So what we're seeing here, just observing this, is that perhaps the migration from Puerto Rico is slowing down right now, but it'll be interesting to see what the 2020 census does show us. So perhaps the growth of the Puerto Rican population now is partially due to the interstate migration or just natural growth of the community in the state. Now let's look at county level, right? So here I have Pennsylvania right here. And again, we're gonna have to refer to the 5-year estimates. So the difference between the 1 year and the 5-year is that the 5-year gives us more geography. So we're able to look at county level, city level, census tract level, whereas the 1-year estimates, although it's much higher numbers, only gives us, state and selected counties, right? So the 5-year may look like it takes the average of the last 5 years of the census. But in any case, this should give us an idea of where Puerto Ricans are mostly residing in at the county level. So as you can see here, Philadelphia County or Philly, 30% of the community resides in Philadelphia County. Lehigh County is by Berks, Lancaster, Northampton, about 5%, and so on. Now, when we sort of I know I'm throwing out all these numbers, so I do apologize, but it's just to sort of build on the context right here. When we look at sort of the population size, you can see obviously Lehigh County contains the second largest group, but Lehigh County did grow from 2017 to 2019, growing meaning like the Puerto Rican population from 46,000 to 48,000. And then we see that that was like an 8.9% percent change. But Carbon County showed the largest percent change with 17%, with the community growing from 1,692 to 1,800. But again, this just sort of gives us an idea of just like the growth of the community, and also when we compare each of these counties. Now, I would also like to refer you to some data products that we put together at Centro that relates to Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania. And we're looking to perhaps updating some of these products. But here's a data sheet that we've produced back in 2018. And what we did was we compared Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania between 2010 to 2016. So I just sort of selected some very quick facts. So we saw that in this report, that the growing employment opportunities for Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania seems to be the main characteristics of the growth of the population. So perhaps that employment is what's driving Puerto Ricans into the state. But we did see a lot of disparities in educational attainment between Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania relative to stateside Puerto Ricans and Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, where we saw that Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania educational attainment, they did have higher population, a higher proportion with the population with less than a high school diploma. So when we compare that to stateside Puerto Ricans and Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico. In terms of like the job industry, we did see that Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania had higher rates of those in the service industry when we compare that to the state's overall population. So about a quarter of the Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania worked in the service industry. And when we compare that to the state overall, that was about 17.9%. And that's the same, a bit with the other Latinos in the state. Now, this is pretty interesting. When we looked at the rate of home ownership among Puerto Ricans in PA, it was slightly higher when we compare those to other Puerto Ricans in other states. So home ownership tends to be a bit higher when we compare it to other Puerto Ricans in other states. But on the other hand, Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, rented their homes significantly lower than Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania. So I provided the link here, and then you're more than welcome to dig in a little bit deeper, but we're looking into perhaps updating this report. So this gives us a really nice socio-demographic, take on Puerto Ricans in PA. Here's infographics. Here, this is another product that we have available, but I want to, hold on, did it go? Nope, okay. Oh, here we go. So this infographic, again, it's available to you. This is just looking at a map. Oh, can you guys see? No, I'm not sharing. Hold on. Can you share? Can you see the map? Yeah, the blue map. Okay. So with this blue map, we mapped Puerto Ricans in PA. So as you can see here, majority of the Puerto Ricans live on the eastern coast of the state, less than on the west coast. But you could definitely see here the sort of the concentration of Puerto Ricans within these counties right here. And then with this infographic, we sort of dig a bit deeper with health insurance coverage, housing tenure. So even though I did say that Puerto Ricans have higher home ownership, so when we compare that to Pennsylvania, Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania have higher home ownership rates than other Puerto Ricans in other states. They are, they do show higher renters within the state. So about 60% of Puerto Ricans are renters. And, we sort of go in with language proficiency right here. We see that 60% of the Puerto Rican population speak another language than English. So, Spanish. And this is interesting right here with the age distribution. About 36% of the Puerto Rican population are under the age of 18. So these are your folks that are in your schools and, in sort of the K through 12. So that would be very interesting to sort of look in about, education policies and stuff like that. And when we look at educational attainment, about 35% of the Puerto Rican population have at least a high school degree. And then this is very interesting. When we look at bachelor degrees or higher, it's only about 11.4%, but females tend to show a bit higher rates with those with the BA or higher than males, slightly higher. So yeah, this is all available to you. Let me get back to my presentation here. Whoops, let me see, share screen. Here's another product that we've produced related to with COVID and the Puerto Rican communities. This is a dashboard, so I just took a screenshot just in case anything goes wrong here. But here we looked at the social impact indices. We looked at the rate of infection when we compared to Puerto Ricans and to other groups. So again, the map that we saw before with the Puerto Rican population, we saw that here they were highly sort of impacted in regards to COVID, right? So I thought this was very interesting as well. And then we looked at other indices such as food insecurity, overcrowding, digital divide index. And this is very interesting when we look at the county level to see, access to internet, which was very important during COVID in regards to remote learning. But yeah, all of this is available to you. And there's a lot of data to dig in, so I could go on and on about this. But this is definitely for you to, to look into. And let me see, I think that's about it. So I will provide all of these links to you in the chat box, and that resumes my presentation. So I know there's a lot of numbers, but I just wanted to provide some context for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Again, we'll have time for questions at the end, and if time allows, we can revisit some of those, especially infographics. Next up, we have Erika Davis. If you could take the stage.
Sure, thank you so much. And yeah, this is great going after Jennifer because, my research really is looking a little bit at both the numbers and some of the qualitative data, right, about what the experiences of Latinos right now, sort of in Allentown and the Lehigh Valley, where we have these narratives of these growing numbers, right? This research is really important to me. I'm in Allentown. I was born and raised in Allentown. I've lived in Allentown my whole life. My grandparents moved from Puerto Rico to New York City in the 40s, and in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, they moved to Allentown, right? And so some of these migration stories are really important to me because I have this personal stake in it, and kind of growing up and being sort of in the Allentown school district and leaving for a little bit of time to go to Florida, and then kind of coming back and seeing kind of how Latino narratives are really different based on different contexts, and sort of learning a lot more about some of the narratives that have been present in the Lehigh Valley for decades that have been sort of hidden, right? And kind of seeing how people are excavating that work has been very meaningful for me, and that's what I want to focus my own personal research on. So this research is some preliminary research for my dissertation, and so I've titled it, the title changes every couple of weeks, but the idea is kind of talking about improvement for whom and how these discourses of development, like the neighborhood improvement zone in Allentown, the city revitalization and improvement zone in Bethlehem, how these narratives kind of are coinciding with this displacement, this dispersal of the valley's growing Latinx population. Okay. There we go. So Basically, when I started this work, I very quickly stumbled upon three major works, four if we count Wilberto Sicard's thesis, right? And he's presenting today, which is very exciting. But starting with this 1994 New York Times article, The Latinization of Allentown, Pennsylvania, where Allentown really starts receiving national attention in the news media for this growing and significant Latinx population, largely coming from New York City, right? And in 2000, we see the work of Muhlenberg professor Anna Adams really excavating the history, tracing the history of Latinxes, particularly Puerto Ricans, in Allentown and the Lehigh Valley back to 1899 during the Spanish-American War, right? And also she's really purposeful in her book, which is available for free online, by the way, and I will throw the link in the chat after. In her book, she's really purposeful about naming how that history has been hidden and excluded in narratives about Allentown's past, right? So she wrote this book because when she went to go to the Allentown Public Library and look up some research on Latinos in Allentown, there was nothing there, right? And so this work is like really meaningful, the work that we're having today, right? That we're talking about today in kind of bringing these stories, which are there, right? And they're in archives that are not formal, right? They're not formalized archives, but we're excavating those histories, and that's so important. Flash forward to 2010, Edgar Sandoval publishes another book about Latinos in Allentown, right? The New Face of Small Town America. And this book is really important because in 2010, he's predicting, right, that the Latino experience in Allentown is like what will be the experience in small towns across America in like the next 20 to 30 years, right? And so I think that this is such an interesting timeline, right, where we see some of these narratives. And what I'm interested in my preliminary research for my dissertation is kind of looking at how those narratives have kind of changed in the last 15 years and what those narratives are now. So part of my research has been this media analysis of the Morning Call articles and how in the Morning Call, Latinx population growth has been portrayed. What are the discourses about this population growth over the past 15 years? And I have to shout out my co-author, Tatiana, who's in the audience today. We were both up very late, still working on these numbers. So basically, what I've been finding is that 2006 is a really interesting year for the narratives in the Morning Call. In Allentown, in particular, in the Lehigh Valley. So in 2006, we see like this national immigration movement going on. And so immigration is being discussed, and Latinos and the growing Latino population is being discussed at the national level. And it's also really it's really prominent in the local discourses as well. So in 2006 in Hazleton, right, we see the harshest anti-immigrant ordinance being put in place in the country at the time, right? And a city councilman in Allentown proposes the same for Allentown, right? And Allentown shoots it down. We don't adopt that ordinance, but it sparks a lot of conversation in the media, in the discourses about this growing Latinx population, what makes it different from that population in Allentown, and how we even see this resistance, not only resistance to the idea of this ordinance, but a pushback in the opposite direction. And there's calls that Allentown might become a sanctuary city, right? And so I think it's really important to see these discourses really represent both sides of the argument. But unfortunately, since 2006, what we are finding is that there's really been a displacement of Latinxes in these mainstream discourses. And so this kind of is a chart that shows you that from 2006 to 2019, there's been a significant and sustained decline in Morning Call articles with terms about Hispanic, Latino, Puerto Rican, Mexican, Dominican that are in the lead or first paragraph, right? And I have another slide that shows, just in case you're wondering, this is from 1990 to 2019. So you really see that like after 2006, there is this really significant decline, right? And so I choose 2006, we choose 2006, and we're looking at that and we're putting it into the context of like what was going on then, what has been happening since 2006, right? And one of the things that we're finding in our preliminary results, right, is all these discourses of revitalization that were happening earlier, like in these 2006 article, Hispanic businesses are savoring a boom, right? The Latino market is vibrant, right? There's all these like empowering discourses about Latinos that really match what we see in Edgar Sandoval's book, this revitalization of Allentown, post industrialization, post all of this white flight, right, from the city. Latinos are coming and they're revitalizing the town. But after 2006, revitalization and development is really centered around NIS. It's really centered around the CRIS, and it's centered around the arena. It's centered around new condos, bringing millennials, right? And so there's sort of this displacement of like Latinxes as the revitalizing force in Allentown and the Lehigh Valley. So another couple of articles that kind of lays this out is, you know, in 2010, 2011, we get the 2010 census results, and Allentown is named the fastest growing city in Pennsylvania, right? And it's due to this Latino surge, as it's worded in the Morning Call articles, right? Yet 3 days later, they published an article claiming that Latinos have no strength in numbers. So despite there being this huge surge of Latinos in Pennsylvania, in the Lehigh Valley, in Allentown, the Morning Call article claims that they have no political clout and no economic clout, which is really kind of going against what we saw, you know, even just back in 2006 with the more empowering articles and discourses. And then in 2016, right, this is a really important year as well, where we see, you know, the Trump election and whatnot. In 2016, Julio Guridi suggests, you know, this idea that maybe we could add Spanish language street signs along 7th Street, call it Calle Siete, right? And this would be in recognition of all of these Latinx owned businesses that are lining the street, right? Trying to bring back that revitalization narrative that we see these small Hispanic owned businesses growing, and that we need to honor them in some way. And this receives a ton of backlash. In fact, Bill White, who's, you know, an employee of the Morning Call, writes this op-ed in which he calls it, the idea is tone deaf and divisive. He calls it emotionally, culturally, economically, and intellectually terrible. Right? So we see these discourses of disempowerment really coming out of the media in this time, right? And it's not that these discourses were never there, right? So something that Tatiana and I have found is that, you know, if you look back in op-eds, even back as far as, you know, the 1990s and 2006, all these years where we were seeing some positive stuff going on in the news, there was a lot of negative as well, right? But when we see this huge decline in the frequency of, you know, articles which center Latinos in the region, and then at the same time, this rise in these discourses of disempowerment, it's, you know, it's very problematic, right? And so I think, like, I've been trying to explore some of this and kind of contextualize it and relate it to some of the development that we're seeing in the region. And so part of that analysis has been like through these maps, using census data at the block group level. So I have this Bethlehem map, right? And this Bethlehem map is from 2010. And here's the change, right, in the Latinx population density across block groups in Bethlehem from 2010 to 2019, right, with the light yellow being 0 to 10% Latinx population, and then the dark blue being up to 91 to 100%, right? And so we see that there is growth, right? This growth narrative is really relevant, and also dispersal, right? There are Latinos who are moving into all different neighborhoods, right, across the city. But kind of importantly, I was looking at where's the loss, right? So this map actually has like each block group marked as either growth, loss, or no change. And then these like orange patches are supposed to be the CRIS, right? This is where the development is slated, right, in Bethlehem. And so notably in the South Bethlehem community, the two of the three block groups that lost Latinx population density are coinciding with the condos, right? The housing units, the student housing, the condos that are going up in South Bethlehem, right? In Allentown, it's even starker because the Allentown NIS has this little map you can overlay. So it's really clear, actually. If you look in the center city of Allentown, the purple outline is the downtown NIS, and then the waterfront NIS, which hasn't been developed yet. And at the downtown NIS from 2010 to 2019, there's this stark decrease, right, in the Latinx population density that it goes against what we're seeing at the citywide level, where we're seeing a huge amount of growth, right, in almost all of these other block groups. This is kind of like a close-up where you can see that this is where the arena has been put up. This is where condos are being put up. This is where businesses were bought out, right? Hispanic and Latino-owned businesses were bought out. And so Latinos are being, to some degree, dispersed, right, and displaced. But I think it's also really important, and what I'm trying to do with my research now is kind of excavate these stories of resistance, right? So that is another theme that we really want to emphasize today is the Latino population may be being pushed out of this block group, but look at all the other block groups they're going into, and how are Latinos then claiming those spaces and using those spaces and rebuilding their businesses and rebuilding the city still, right? And so that's some of the work that I'm trying to do. I have this poster that you guys can download from Twitter if you want, and I'm happy to send you guys these maps because I was really excited to make them, and I would love if anybody wants to use them. So there's my email as well, but I'll throw this stuff in the chat. So thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Erika. It's beautiful to see how the presentations here are really intertwining as far as data and what it tells us about the Latino communities in our area. Next up, we have Mericel talking about being Dominican in Reading. So Mericel, if you could take it away.
All right, hi everyone. So like Miranda said, my name is Mericel Mirabal. I'm currently a senior here at Lehigh, and I'm double majoring in sociology and Latin American studies with a minor in Africana studies, a certificate in the global citizenship program, and I'm also on the pre-law track here. I am of Dominican descent, and my hometown is Reading, PA, which is what inspired this presentation. So welcome to Being Dominican in Reading, Pennsylvania. Dear Reading, dear Reading, when I was a kid, I dreamed of the day I would leave. I felt my dreams were far too big for this small, poor city. I felt my dreams were far too big for this small, poor city. But slowly, you began to feel like home. A home that welcomed me in and embraced me with a warm hug and a Dios te bendiga, a kiss on the cheek or a cafecito con leche. Dear Reading, I grew up on North Front Street, a short walk from my neighborhood bodega and my elementary school, Lowers Park, playing with the kids on my block until nighttime would loom. Mommy would rush us back into the house, scolding us for staying out too long, too afraid the bad influence, the drugs, the crime would get to us. My childhood innocence quickly ripped from me as I slept to the sound of gunshots and sirens. Dear Reading, the outsiders only had negative things to say about you. Reading is one of the poorest cities in America. Reading has so much crime, it's too dangerous, and nothing good can come from Reading. I wanted to kick, scream, cry, and yell. Yell at them for saying they don't want to step foot in Reading. Scream that they claimed Reading for the pagoda, for Lonnie, or when it was convenient. Tell them that they didn't understand, they never would. I wanted to prove them all wrong and silence their voices, yet the reality was too hard for me to escape. Dear Reading, Papi woke up every day to go to work at 4 in the morning, sometimes not returning until 7 or 8 at night. He worked at a meat processing plant in Souderton, where his broken English would not be required. The commute so far, he rarely got a second to relax. His income still not enough to make ends meet for a family of 4. We survived off of food stamps and Medicaid. Dear Reading, I witnessed people drop out of school. My graduating class went from 1,200 students to 800. Some taken in by the streets, some forced to work, some fearing deportation. Dear Reading, in the face of adversity, we, are the roses that grew from the concrete. Every no, every you can't, every setback, every challenge pushed me to find comfort in the warmth of my city and everything that it offered me. In the loud bachata and merengue blasting on the block, making people dance, in the busyness and loud chatter of people on 5th Street and Penn Street, and the sound of Spanish flirting with my ears, in the hope-filled halls of the castle on the hill, and the breathtaking panoramic view of my sleepless city from the pagoda, convinced me that good can come from Reading, that we can make it to the NBA, that we can go to college, that we can be musicians, poets, authors, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and most of all, that we can and will succeed. Dear Reading, you believed in me before I believed in myself. You pushed me not to give up, to fight 10 times harder. I bleed red and black before brown and white, and I am proud to be just a kid from Reading. Dear Reading, I am lucky to call you my home. So that was just a poem that I wrote a year ago for a class that I actually had with Dr. Jimenez. And I wrote it because I wanted to capture like what the true meaning of Reading was to me. So moving on a little bit, I just wanted to share some background. This is actually a photo that I took of my block on North Front Street in Reading. I moved to Reading from another big Dominican community, which was in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And I moved to Reading when I was 6 years old, and I grew up on North Front Street, which happens to be in the southwest region of Reading. And I've lived there for most of my entire life. My parents are both Dominican immigrants from Tenares Salcedo, Dominican Republic. And one of the reasons that we migrated was because we could afford to purchase a house in Reading, and we felt that there would be more job opportunities. And additionally, we had like family and friends that had already lived there, so we knew that we would have community and a support system. And this past summer, I actually interned with the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute. And I found that this was actually true for many Dominicans that migrate to Pennsylvania. They migrate to Pennsylvania because they think that there will be more job opportunities, be cheaper housing, and there's space for community. Another reason for this is also because of their perceptions of safety. They thought that the crime and drug, even though the crime and drug rates were similar to that of cities like the Bronx, they still felt it was a safer living environment for them to raise their children. And so moving on to some demographics of Reading, the population is currently around 95,000 based off of the 2020 census, and it is currently the Pennsylvania's 4th largest city. Reading's municipality now has the largest population of Latinos in Pennsylvania, as also per the 2020 census, given that the population is at 69%. The 3 largest Latinx groups in Reading are Puerto Rican, Dominican, and Mexican. And so over the summer, I did some research with CUNY, as I mentioned, and I tried to find the exact percentage of Dominicans in Reading, but there's not enough research done on this subject for me to know. So it's very limited in that aspect. So moving on a little bit to Reading High School, or one second, I think I skipped a few slides. There we go. Growing up, my neighborhood was considered to be very dangerous. My brother and I were never allowed to stay out late. We would hear gunshots all the time, and police sirens were pretty much a daily occurrence, as I mentioned in the poem. And in 2011, Reading was actually named the #1 poorest city in America. And even to this date, there are 32.7% of the Reading population is still in poverty. And given that Reading is a city filled with people of color and is impoverished, many of the suburban neighborhoods have discriminated against us and have written us off as being a place that you never want to travel to or visit. And I want you to like think back to any time that you've heard people mention to you like, oh, don't travel to Reading. Reading is a super dangerous place. Like you don't want to find yourself there. And as I said in my poem, like I've heard many of these stereotypical things about how there seems to be no hope for the residents of Reading and nothing good can come from Reading. And as a young child, you know, like you just kind of absorb all of these narratives, and this reality sort of forced us to grow up a lot faster than normal. And it was like we lost that childhood innocence. before we even reached adulthood, and it just kind of became ingrained in us. So moving on to Reading High School, this is where I went to high school, and it's often referred to as the Castle on the Hill. It's currently grades 9 through 12. And I mention this because when I went to Reading High School, it was only grades 10 to 11. And it currently holds more than 3,000 students, and the graduation rate is approximately that of 71%. Castle on the Hill. My high school was nicknamed the Castle on the Hill, though its name didn't quite fit what people thought of us. Ridiculed us the way that we talked and laughed at us for not having new textbooks and technology. They pointed their fingers at us for underperforming in every subject and taunted us with every statistic or stereotype we ever met. Yet they would never know what it was like to walk those halls and to climb those stairs, to be on the Castle on the Hill. It was the liveliest place I've ever been, filled with 3,000 plus students. Every day, a new sight to see, a new experience. The foreigners, the gualas, chismeando in the hallway, who helped me master the art of Spanglish. The band kids congregated at the octagon or the band room. The senior cafeteria where everyone skipped class or had study hall. On February 27th, all the Dominicans would pop out. Everyone brought their flags, their shirts, plátanos even. There was loud music blasting in the hall to celebrate. People yelling, de lo mío, and ya tú sabes, as we were overjoyed con la independencia de nuestro bello país. The pep rallies were vibrant with energy. The one day of the year, everyone had school spirit. Every class yelling out their graduating year. 1-8, you'd hear my class yell. Can I get a red Knights? Red Knights, we'd respond. Our school colors were red and black, but they were more than colors to us. And Reading High was more than just a school to us. It was an escape of the reality we faced, the place where some students could get their only meal of the day. It was a place where some students could find shelter, choosing to join after-school programs so they wouldn't have to go home or to the streets. It was a place where we dreamed big, where we had hopes for the future, for the day that we would accomplish our dreams, for the day that we made it out of poverty, for the day that we became successful. So as you can see by the image, we were very prideful and the energy was always amazing. The city usually also holds a ceremony on the same day to raise a flag, and there's usually a celebration that follows it. And actually, personally, it's been quite a long time since I've celebrated our Independence Day, since that's not really done here at Lehigh. And moving on a little bit, in my community, the push to go into higher education is very strong, as it is seen as one of the only ways out of poverty and out of the city. I graduated from Reading High School in 2018, along with 800 other students. In the fall of 2018, I began to attend Lehigh University, which is a predominantly white institution. This was obviously quite different for me, given the demographics of Reading. Despite not feeling like I belonged on the campus and struggling with imposter syndrome for some time, I found some comfort in the Lehigh Valley because of places like the South Bethlehem and Allentown reminded me of home, since these cities are also predominantly Latinx and they have a big Dominican presence as well. However, talking a little bit more about Reading, despite having more Latinx people in the city, many still felt like they had no power or agency as they should. For example, the city council is still 2/3 white, even despite having a Puerto Rican mayor, and the Reading police force is only 16% Latinx. Daniel Egusquiza, who is the director of Barrio Alegría, feels like some people need to relinquish the power that they have in order to let others step up. In an interview with the Reading Eagle, he mentions that the process of building Latinos' comforts with the institutions that have been predominantly non-Latino and might not be supportive is hard and messy. I actually had the pleasure of interning with Barrio Alegría in the summer of 2020. Barrio is a community engagement organization that utilizes the arts to develop and empower leaders. The goal is essentially to create strong leaders and a community where the members feel safe and heard. Hopefully with more organizations like these, the narratives in Reading will change because we, the people of Reading, will take the power back and make them ours. And that is all for my presentation. I will always be proud to be from Reading, and I just wanted to share a glimpse of that with all of you.
Thank you so much, Mericel. Again, we'll hold off on questions for our last panelist. Wilberto Sicard, if you could share your findings with us.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen with you all. Let's see here. Oh, give me 1 second. I just need to allow my security on my laptop to share. Sorry, I haven't shared on this laptop yet. All right, there we go. Can everyone see that? All right, so hello everyone, my name is Wilberto Sicard. Many of you know me as either just Birdo, so that's my nickname, that's fine too. Just wanted to share, so I'm sharing, before I start, my pronouns are he, him. I was born and raised in Allentown, Pennsylvania, like Erika. I went through the Allentown School District. I graduated from William Allen High School in 2016. I think my graduating class was about 650 students. I graduated then from Lehigh University in 2020, and now I'm at Yale Law School. I'm mostly interested in civil rights and criminal justice reform. I'm currently working with the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women in Connecticut to help incarcerated women get out of jail. And then I'm also looking to do some civil rights work in Philadelphia this summer. So that's a little bit about me, and I wanted to thank everyone who's here and everyone who's has presented so far. All of these presentations are amazing and super enlightening. So my presentation is focused on it's focused on my thesis. I wrote it throughout my senior year in college at Lehigh. It took me about 2 semesters to complete. It's called City with Limits. The Allentown's nickname is City Without Limits. So this is kind of a play on the city's nickname. And it's meant to kind of talk about the other side of Allentown that doesn't get a whole lot of publicity or attention. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to share my screen. I mean, how to share the PowerPoint. I guess I'll just scroll. All right. And the full title is City with Limits, an untold history of residential segregation and education inequality in Allentown, Pennsylvania. So there's 4 parts. I'll run through them very quickly. The first one's the introduction, and then these are the 4 chapters of the thesis. First one's introduction. The second one is called One City, Two Neighborhoods. In that part, I talk about residential segregation. The third chapter is A Tale of Two Schools. I talk mostly about education inequality there, and the fourth part is the conclusion. So in the introduction, again, the city's nickname is City Without Limits, and the city's nickname was adopted to kind of in 2010 to talk about like the rebounding economy after the Great Recession in Allentown. And my contention is that people of color in Allentown, African American people and Latinx people, couldn't really embrace this nickname in the same way because to them, Allentown's history and its future were defined by strict and oppressive limits. And this thesis talks about those limits. This is based on a book called The Color of Law. It's a book by Richard Rothstein. He was a professor at UC Berkeley Law School when he wrote the book. And he talks about, it's based on this famous Supreme Court, not very famous, but a Supreme Court case in 2007. It was decided, there were 4 votes for and 4 votes against. And the case was about desegregation in the Seattle school system, and also Kentucky. These school districts tried to like voluntarily desegregate, and they were stopped from doing so by the Supreme Court. And 4 justices voted for it, 4 against, and the swing vote, Justice Kennedy voted with the traditional conservatives, who were Alito, Scalia, Clarence Thomas, and I forget the last one. So they, and in the majority opinion, the Chief Justice John Roberts, that's who it was, he voted with conservatives as well. He said that if residential segregation were the fault of the government, then it would be their fault. It would be their responsibility to fix it. But he said that's not the case. Residential segregation was the fault of private individuals making private decisions. So the government has no responsibility to address this problem or to fix it, legally, that is. And Richard Rothstein's argument is that I'll take you for your word and show you how the government segregated neighborhoods. And then if using your own logic, then we have to say that the government's responsible to fix this. So I applied that same reasoning to Allentown, and I'm trying to show how Allentown was segregated by the local government. Just some quick background. In 1960, 745 African-American people lived in Allentown. There were not many Latinx people there at all. It was a predominantly white city. And of the 745 African-Americans who lived there, 528 lived in the downtown area. This is part of the 7th Street area that has come up already. And it's like where the Hamilton Business District is today, where the stadium is and all of that other stuff now. These people they didn't just live there necessarily because they wanted to. They were forced to live there by mostly by racist private practices. Landlords and homeowners wouldn't sell or rent their homes to people outside of like this small like city area, the downtown area. So if someone in fact, if an African American tried to buy a home in the west end of Allentown, which is out more toward the suburbs, they would not be allowed to do so. So this was kind of like a Jim Crowism in Allentown. And banks also would not give mortgages to people of color, even when they made the same amount of money as white individuals. And that the data and the sources for that is in my thesis, which I can share with all of you. And these practices made up what we call de facto segregation. So it wasn't the government doing it, it was private individuals. In the 1960s, the government began what they called urban redevelopment. This is what I call de jure segregation. So this is the government segregating people. And urban redevelopment in the state of Pennsylvania was allowed by a law called Urban Redevelopment Law. It was a statute passed by the state Congress. And it allowed cities to get funding from the state and federal government to do what they called redevelop blighted areas. And what that mostly meant were areas inhabited by people of color. And in Allentown, that meant the downtown area. So from 1959 to 1963, the government bought the homes of the African-American people who lived there. They tore it all up and they built the business areas. So if you go to downtown Allentown, where the city courthouse is, the local government building on 4th Street, all of that used to be owned by private individuals and mostly people of color. And their homes were bought and torn apart to build these areas. And the local, state, and federal government funded millions of dollars to do all of this. A lot of the African-American people who lived there did not really want to sell their homes, but eminent domain came into the picture, so they were forced to, and a lot of them received lower values for their homes than what the homes were actually worth. When these people had, the data shows that about 30 African-American families relocated, which doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, there were only about 500 of them, so it's a pretty significant number. When they were forced to relocate, they were only allowed to live in the downtown area. So they were told that, again, you can't live anywhere except this area. So the city's actions caused them to, again, be limited to a certain neighborhood. a lot of the families moved to Little Lehigh. It's off of Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in Allentown, if anyone's driven past there. There's like a housing project there, which I'm going to get to soon. And they were told that this won't happen again. We won't move you again. And that's why they consented in some part. They fought the first one, but not as much. They were more worried about the low values they got for their homes, but they were reassured that this won't happen again. So they left without much protest. In 1964, the city informed them. So a year after they were forced to move, the city informed that they were going to have to move again because they were going to build another urban redevelopment project called the Little Lehigh Housing Project, which is still there. So this time the African-American community said, no, we've had enough, and they fought back. They organized with the NAACP, and there were all of these articles in the Morning Call, which are in my thesis, and I will share with you again. And they lost that battle in 1968. So they were forced to move, and the city was able to build the Little Lehigh Housing Project. And a lot of the people who had to move didn't have many places to go to because the inner city area had been considerably redeveloped. So a lot of them did end up actually living in the Little Lehigh Housing Project, which again, it kept them in the downtown area and it took away their homeowning status. So in the beginning of this talk, in the beginning of this presentation, like all the way back, we got some data about homeownership rates and renter rates. Part of the reason why renter rates for Puerto Ricans for people of color and African Americans in Pennsylvania is higher is because they lost their homes at this time, and they were forced to rent or live in government housing. So those were one of the legacies of these two projects. And then that's when Puerto Ricans come into the picture. So before the 1970s, not many Puerto Ricans lived in Allentown. There have been what people consider three major waves of Puerto Rican migration. There probably will be a lot more as we do more research. But the first one came right after Operation Bootstraps. And a lot of these Puerto Ricans were looking for jobs, and they moved to New York. The second wave of Puerto Rican migration were New York Puerto Ricans moving to states out in the tri-state area to find jobs and cheaper housing. And that's when, I think Erika mentioned earlier, that's when her grandparents came, I believe. So they're part of that second wave of Puerto Rican migration, but it was the first wave for Allentown. That's when they start getting a lot of Puerto Ricans. So from 1970 to 2000, the Latinx community in Allentown went from 3,000 to 32,000. It's a huge jump. And it also brings up this idea that this is a really good time to diversify, right? We have all of these diverse people coming in. We could really benefit from building a more diverse community here and opening up our arms to welcoming this community. That wasn't the case, though. A lot of the Puerto Ricans were limited to the downtown area. So like the African-American community that was already there, they were told that you can't live outside of this area. So they were denied loans, they were forced to rent there, and they were, in a very similar way to the African-American community, they were restricted to the inner city part of Allentown. And if you look at the census today, parts of that area are still about 70% Latinx and mostly Puerto Rican. And I'm going to run through this part very quickly so we can get to questions. So that's the residential segregation part of this. My second contention of my thesis is that one of the consequences of doing that to your city and forcing people to live in certain areas is that the schools then become impacted. And so what we see is 50 years down the line, William Allen High School, very similar to Reading High School, which we heard about, is 90% African-American or Latinx. Only less than 50% of students go on to college, even fewer graduate college. The graduation rate hovers for around 60%. which is way below the state average. So a lot of disparities is what we see here. And so I compared this to Parkland High School. Parkland High School is in a western suburb of Allentown. They actually, part of the city of Allentown that is predominantly white is carved off and just shipped to the Parkland School District. So even though those people live in the city of Allentown, they go to school in Parkland. So that is the only city in the Lehigh Valley where that happens. Easton and Bethlehem, actually, their school district is bigger than the city lines. So something to think about there. And then also, I compare a few measures between these schools. A lot of the white people who lived in Allentown, when the Puerto Ricans came in, end up leaving white flight into those suburbs of Parkland. And Parkland went from this small rural high school in the 1970s to this large, high-performing public school today because of that white flight. I'm going to compare a few measures. The first one is financial resources. Allentown, William Allen High School, the largest high school in Allentown, was in a $28 million deficit in 2019-2020 school year. Parkland High School in that same year had their 7th year of capital improvements and increased budget for their school district. William Allen spends $4,800 per pupil, Parkland $13,800 per pupil. When you account for disparities in healthcare, in family income, that per pupil value is even higher. Second is education. So 16.3% of students at William Allen take a college class. That number is 83.3% at Parkland. No students at Allen receive a personal laptop prior to COVID. All this research, remember, happened before COVID. At Park, and it impacted how these schools were able to transition during COVID. All students at Parkland receive an Apple laptop. So when COVID happened, they were seamlessly able to transition. William Allen High School, Allentown School District, fumbled for months trying to get laptops out to students. 69% graduation rate, 95 at Parkland, 49% go to college, 81 at Parkland. The physical school buildings, William Allen High School was built in the early 1900s. About $585,000 was the cost of the first building. With inflation, that's in the millions today. But Parkland is a $77 million high school. It's been reported that its features like the auditorium and gym and the square footage rival or exceed local colleges like Muhlenberg. So Parkland has a more expensive and larger gym than Muhlenberg College, which is a top 60 liberal arts college in the US. Allen has 443,000 square feet in the building, and Parkland has 478. Parkland also has way more space, like parking and like grounds than William Allen, which is like on a couple city blocks. Extracurriculars, 38 clubs at Allen, 67 in Parkland. The school's only won one district sports championship in the 2010s and one theater award. Parkland has won 8 in just 1 year, and they've won state titles in 2011, 2012, 2014, 2015, 2016. So what am I saying here? I'm not, this is not to bring Allentown School District or William Allen down. It's to say that because of the way that we segregated our cities in the 1960s and 70s, this has had a very real impact on how our students are able to succeed today. And William Allen doesn't, they're not able to provide for their students in the same way because a lot of their resources were shipped out of the city because of white flight and because of residential segregation. This funding formula in Pennsylvania, so the way we fund our schools is based heavily on property tax. Allentown, because of the lower value of their houses and lower income of their population, just cannot fund the school district, even though the property tax rate is higher in Allentown than in Parkland. So we tax our people more, but get a third of what other schools get in the area. And part of what we could do to balance that is when we're increasing public housing, not just to do it in the downtown area, but do it in white majority suburbs, right? That way the city's population is spread out more. Also build low-income housing in these places so people can own homes in these white majority suburbs and diversify them. And then when we think about the city area, we can restructure charter school funding at the state level to remove some of the burden on the Allentown School District. And I can talk about more about that if people want to. But also we need to increase property tax on the booming business district. I have a picture of it there for you that hopefully you can see. We have all these new buildings and restaurants and businesses coming into Allentown. A lot of them have been given tax breaks under the neighborhood improvement zone to build their businesses there. Because of that incentive that we've given them, let's have them funnel money back and invest in the city that they do their business in and in the students that live in that city. We also can put money toward developing houses in the area. So not just pushing people out by building new buildings there that are gonna force them to leave, but giving people money to improve their homes and make renovations to help the value come up. And this is probably the most radical one, but another, and out with this, another idea is that we could restructure the school boundary lines to create more diverse school districts in the Lehigh Valley. So we can change the way that we draw the lines and where students are picked from to have more equity, and not just funding, but also in the student population. So that's all I have. Thanks everyone for bearing with me, and let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Wilberto. Awesome presentation. Thank you for the really practical applications at the end. It's evident how these different pieces of research can really be in conversation. That said, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself to ask of any of our 4 panelists here. Yeah, Laura.
I couldn't find the electronic raise my hand, so I went old school, raise my hand. So, wow. Thank you, everybody. This was just great. I'm so glad I tuned into this afternoon. And all of your work is super compelling, and I could ask a lot of questions. But I really just want to ask Erika, because I have to jump off in a couple minutes, but I wanted to ask, so I remember reading the morning call pretty regularly, and then the paywall hit, right? Like they had to you get so many accounts. And I'm wondering, just, if you don't know or whatever, but it's just an interesting question to me. I wonder how the timeline of did their readership change? Are they, playing a different tune or something to a different readership when the paywall went up? Was one thing. And then also, I think really everybody could probably, my second question, or just something to think about, would be just the overlay of school demographics to, we looked at neighborhood demographics, but I'm wondering how school demographics are changing. And then I see some folks here also very familiar with the school systems and how the schools are responding to the changes in the districts.
Yeah, that's a great question. In particular, I'm not sure how maybe the morning calls, restructuring, especially as it's moved more extensively into its online platforming as well, may have potentially changed some of the discourses, right? I think that what would be really beneficial to kind of add on to this project would be, including the morning call in this process and kind of going to them with this and saying hey, can you guys explain what's going on here, right? Because media can be representative of some of the larger discourses in an area, but it's also really heavily influenced by the actual organization, right? Its curation, who's behind it, who's kind of making these decisions, right? And so I think that that's something that Tatiana and I have talked about, would be really neat for us to kind of go forward with that. And my research is actually focused on education. So I'm getting a PhD in education. So my dissertation will focus on actually how Latinx residents in Allentown are navigating some of these racialized city politics in order to advocate for access to additional educational resources. So like, that's something that I really want to explore. Like your second question, right, is like putting this all in the context of then schools, right? And how are schools and the shifting demographics at the school level here really tied to the city level politics that are going on and the history of racialization in Allentown, right? And so that's something that I hope to be answering to some degree in my dissertation and exploring with community members. But so the morning call, like, I want to keep that project like going on the side, but it won't be the main focus. This was more of like a contextual piece at least.
So on my end, I think I didn't include anything that relates to school age children, except for that little infographic part where we looked at the under 18 age group amongst the Puerto Rican population. But there's this National Center for Education Statistics database that I highly recommend. And the beauty of that is that you're able to look at the racial breakdown of the student population by school districts, and you could even go down to the zip code level, whether if it's, I don't know if they have private schools there as well, but we've used this in our other reports at Centro, looking at the sort of those who receive free school lunches or their school lunches are partially paid for. So it's called the National Center for Education Statistics. It's pretty user friendly. So, yeah.
So there's some data available for that. I'm going to share a PowerPoint in the chat with everyone. So there's a law firm in Philadelphia. They're doing they're suing the state government to try to restructure the way that Pennsylvania funds its schools. They're currently in the Commonwealth Court. They're arguing, actually, I think they started this month, and they will be they'll get to the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court. But I'm going to share their presentation with you. So they have some data on like racial demographics for the schools and income, like the joint like funding and racial demographics. So the presentation is there. You can look at that. And part of I do want to say we haven't really talked about reparations, really, at least on this particular topic. But I did want to say a lot of the solutions that I talked about and that you'll find in that presentation are around taxes and redistribution. A lot of it, I know those are two heavily charged like topics, but the reality is that without those two things, there's no way to fix the funding problems, no way to fix the residential segregation. So it's not something that we can run away from. And we need enough political will to get people to say, this is what we want, and push our state legislator to make those changes. Otherwise, these problems are going to continue to persist because a lot of our communities just don't have the resources to dig ourselves out of the ditch that we didn't dig, right? That was dug for us.
Thank you. I see, Mary, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank each and every one of you. Your stories were so powerful. The data that you presented and the way that you used it was just so artful. And I have such a huge appreciation for each of your work and what you're doing. And so I think so much of what you guys talked about is like this idea of Latinx invisibility, changes in policy historically, and the changes in demographics. And, you know, Birdo, your work, you really talked about policy and shifts that happened 50 years ago. So thinking about that, what types of policy or changes would you want to see now that you think would help to, you know, alleviate some of the issues that we've talked about, or you think that would help? And that's like such a charged question, because if you ask me that question, I'd be like, I don't, stuff, right? So yeah, think about it there. Yeah, thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's the really important question. It's a big one. I think So I think there are a few things that we can do. Again, I think a lot of this, I'm going to get back to this point. I think it hinges on political will. I'll explain what that means at the end because I've said it a couple of times. I think what we're doing here, research, is crucial. I don't think a lot of politics in the US, I think, has become like very emotions based. And I don't think research solves everything, right? Like just looking at numbers, but it can help inform our decisions. And if we don't do the research, we won't know how we got here, right? It's easy to say that, well, maybe Allentown School District is in the financial hole it's in because of their own fault. But when we look back 50 years, we see that that's not really the case, right? The local government had a role in this. Segregation impacted this. So I think research is crucial, and the city government, the state government can play a really important role there in funding and bringing in the scholars that are on this call right now. I think the second thing is gentrification. There's a really good book showing how more people of color moving to the suburbs, right? And obviously our city areas are becoming more white. And that's obvious to see when we look at Manhattan. I mean, Manhattan used to be the center of Puerto Ricans, like on the continental US. Today, it's very far from that. And that's only within 50 years. So we need to figure out how to invest in our communities without pushing all the people who live there and call that place their home out. And I don't, that how to do that is hard. I think one of the ways I talked about a little bit about already is home renovations, helping people fund like improvements to their homes and figuring out how to improve the value of the homes in Allentown and other places without making those people leave, right? I think a lot of other issues plague us, like mass incarceration is something we need to address, which will, so many of the women and men and other people in our community can't contribute because they're thrown in jail for so long. And when they come back, they don't have opportunities because they're being denied those opportunities. So we need to address that. So many things, but a lot of it requires people on the ground saying, these are the changes we want. Without that political will, nothing's going to happen. It'll be business as usual.
And just to piggyback on that, I think also that although the numbers are important, but we also need to hear the voices on the ground as well, because we could look at these numbers over and over again. But I think it's important to, also look at qualitative finding and look at the unmet needs and make an assessment other than just looking, because sometimes, census, they're going to specific neighborhoods and not to others, right? So we need to look at the participation rates of the surveys, and that's available on the census website. So I urge, when we look at numbers, to also think about perhaps conducting some surveys and asking folks on the ground, like, what are the unmet needs or whatever it is that you want to focus on. So that's my little tidbit.
Thank you both. We have time for another question or two. If anyone from the audience would like to ask, or just unmute yourself.
I have a question. I've enjoyed hi, Winston Losey, Boys and Girls Club of Bethlehem resident, was invited by Delia, and I'm just so glad to be here and be a fly on the wall. One of the things that I have noticed and have also been educated to is what white proximity, both in the realistic and in the in diverse or arenas of thought does in communities of color. Would anyone from any of you all who spoke to the information that you shared today be willing to venture out on that topic, as to how white supremacy culture, things of that nature will make, I guess, make this work harder, or how how it affects cohesion within the Latinx community based on what you've presented today?
That's such a low question. It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, we're having a really interesting panel next as well on sort of anti-Blackness, right? Which is the counterpoint to that in the Latinx community it's really important for us to have these conversations. I think about this a lot in Allentown, and I think about some of the limitations that we've seen of Latinxes who have been doing the work, but not getting, the recognition, or not even getting sometimes the support within the community. A lot of times you can't ignore the racial undertones that are there, right? And I think about this especially, with a lot of the city politics. Again, that's an area that I'm really interested in. And I think about the 2017 or 18, there was like a live city council vote to replace the mayor because Ed Pulaski was indicted and sent to jail, right? And the city council was able to vote on who would be the next mayor. And I remember Dr. Hashan Batts, being one of the candidates and being the only, PhD holding, I believe, candidate, and being excluded because he had been previously incarcerated. And, our Afro-Latina representative on the city council standing up for him and being shot down by like crowds from the audience. And I was like watching from Florida on my phone on Facebook Live of people like telling her that, she must not speak English. Somebody needs to explain it to her that her candidate is like not eligible, right? And seeing these like public calls against, that are really racially motivated, right? And there's so many ways to perpetuate white supremacy and racism without talking about racism or calling it racism or saying the words race. But the implication that Cynthia Mota and the backlash that she faced for months after that decision, where she, stuck to her gut and like voted for her candidate as it is her right on the city council 7 times in a row, right? Until she finally, changed to vote for somebody else to break the tie, and how that moment is what led to Mayor Ed O'Connell like coming into the mayor, like, right, like that's something that doesn't get talked about. That's something that I think a lot of people just like normalized or kind of, that's sort of an issue in Allentown, is that I think a lot of Latinos are unwilling to call out some of these really serious racial issues that happen publicly, right? And that have these really powerful consequences, but to some degree have just become normalized. And there are people who are calling it out, and I don't mean in any way to like invisibilize their work either. But I just don't think it's been as prominent, or like those conversations haven't been as uplifted in what I've seen.
Thank you, Erika. I am not a panelist, but to speak to that a little bit, I think there's so much to be said for proximity. I mean, if we consider research that even suggests that a person who has to answer their race and ethnicity on an exam is more likely to test poorly if they are a person of color or identify as non-white. And so, yes, the white supremacy is insidious, and it has negative impacts down to testing and everything in between. And in my opinion, one of the only ways to counteract that is that representation we've been talking about, because in the SEEing research findings, we find that Latinos who have seen and know people who have attained higher education degrees are more likely to do it themselves, right? And so I think there's a lot to be said by who we're surrounded with and where those positive examples of representation come from. One final question before we wrap.
a question I can quickly ask. I was wondering for Mericel also with the Dominican studies, right? And maybe thinking too, like within Latinx, like the underrepresentation of that story of the Dominican journey. And I was wondering, you said some things about like Reading and the city, maybe this is more of a comment, like the city of Reading has this, you know, sort of like the lack of political representation, as opposed to like, you know, maybe representation around you, right? I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, in terms of growing up in an area where representation is not necessarily political representation.
Yeah, it's definitely quite interesting, especially right now, given that Reading has a Puerto Rican like mayor. But in previous years, even despite like even without him, there were like white mayors, and I talked about how 2/3 of the city council is all white. It's kind of just hard when there's people that are making decisions for like the entire like population of Reading, but they don't understand like the struggles that we're going through, and they're not really taking that into account when they're making these decisions. So I remember that there was actually something on a ballot lately. I think it was in the 2020 election. It was like, I can't remember what position, but I think it was for one of the positions to be open to people that didn't reside in Reading. And the way that they worded the question on the election ballot tricked a lot of the residents who were voting, and they basically ended up deciding that people that weren't residents of Reading were going to be able to apply for that position. And so obviously, like, this was devastating, because if you're not from Reading, then you really shouldn't be making the decisions for the like residents of Reading. So it's just been like an ongoing like struggle lately.
Yeah, I wanted to quickly share too a little bit about Reading. I know Mericel brought up the mayor. There was also like a pretty like Reading does have a Puerto Rican mayor, which is amazing, but there was like a huge political controversy when he came into office because the previous mayor wouldn't help facilitate the transition, which, right, that politics can get messy, but it kind of goes to show that even when like there is representation, how those people are treated even when they have like the backing and support of their community. And transitions are hard, and it's so much more complicated when the outgoing person is like, I'm going to hold everything up. So, you know, it might be a small thing, but I think it talks about like the larger issues about like representation and why it's so hard to achieve, and even the problems when we do achieve it.
Awesome. Thank you everyone so much. Final virtual round of applause for our panelists for sharing their findings with us. And thank you to all of you for joining and engaging in the conversation. A couple questions in the chat. This is being recorded and it will be shared, and we are documenting the links and the conversation in the chat to be shared afterwards as well. You all enjoy the rest of your day.
And see you for the next one in colorism panel. If you're able to stay with us for 4:15. Thank you.